The wall shouldn't have sounded hollow. Orville pressed his hand against the wood, deep in the corner of the abandoned barn he'd just bought. Every other wall was solid oak, built to outlast his kids, and their kids after them. But this one answered with emptiness. He knocked again. Thump. 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 The echo came back wrong. Dead. Hollowed out. Someone had sealed this up, and they'd done it recently. The nails were too new, glinting in the slivers of afternoon light. The dust patterns around the edges were too clean, too perfect. Something was off. Footsteps scraped on the gravel outside. An old woman appeared in the doorway, a black silhouette against the blinding sun. Letty Webb. She'd watched him from her porch every time he'd come to inspect the property, her face a mask carved from stone. "You bought it, then?" It wasn't a question. "I did." Her eyes drifted past him, landing squarely on the wall he'd been touching. "Some doors are meant to stay closed." "I didn't find a door." "Not yet," she said, stepping inside. Her expression was grim, the kind that made the blood in your veins slow to a crawl. "But you will, and when you do, you'll wish you'd burned this place to the ground instead." His hand, almost of its own accord, drifted back to the hollow wall. Why? What could possibly be back there? "Because what's behind that wall isn't just hidden," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "It's buried, and the people who buried it made damn sure no one named Banks would ever find it." She paused, letting the words hang in the dusty air. "I know because I watched them seal it shut. I know because my father helped do it." The name hit him like a physical blow. Banks. His name. Letty's eyes never left his, and they were filled with a century of pity. "And the face in those photographs behind that wall? That face is wearing yours." Orville didn't sleep. He couldn't. He sat on the porch of his new house, staring at the barn's dark silhouette against a sky full of cold, distant stars. Letty's words circled his mind like vultures. "That face is wearing yours." His hands wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't from the night chill. It was from the bone-deep certainty that everything he'd ever known, everything he'd built his life upon, was about to shatter into a million pieces. At dawn, he didn't wait. He went back to the barn with a crowbar. The wall fought him at first, groaning in protest. Then, with a sound like bones snapping, it surrendered. Splinters flew. He pried another board loose, then another. A rush of cold, stale air poured from the hollow space, carrying the scent of old paper and dry leather, the smell of things preserved, the smell of things hidden. He squeezed through the opening he'd made, his lantern swinging wildly, casting frantic shadows on the walls of a room that shouldn't exist. It was small, no bigger than a closet, lined with rough-hewn shelves. Documents were stacked in careful, neat piles. Leather-bound journals were tied shut with brittle string. In the center of the room sat a heavy wooden box, and covering one entire wall were photographs. Dozens of them. Faces from another time, staring out with silent, accusing eyes. Orville raised the lantern, its light trembling in his unsteady hand. The first photograph showed a man standing beside a wagon, his hand resting on a young boy's shoulder. He had an angular face, proud and determined. He had features Orville recognized instantly from his own reflection in the mirror every morning. With shaking fingers, he flipped the photograph over. The faded script on the back made his stomach plummet. "Fletcher Whitley," it read. Not Banks. Whitley. He grabbed another photograph. It was the same man, older now, standing right in front of this very barn. A woman stood beside him, holding an infant. The back read, "Sarah Whitley and daughter." His hands trembled as he moved through the images. Different people, different years, but they all carried variations of the same face. His face. But none of them, not a single one, was named Banks. The wooden box sat on the floor, waiting. He knelt and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were documents, yellowed and fragile with age, property deeds, birth certificates, and a journal, its leather cover worn smooth by time and anxious hands. He held the first deed up to the lantern light. This property, this very land he was standing on, had belonged to Fletcher Whitley, purchased in 1873. It was passed to his son, then to his grandson. An unbroken chain of names, all carefully recorded, until the very last entry. The ink was different. The handwriting was newer, more aggressive. A single brutal line that changed everything he thought he knew. Property transferred to Samuel Banks following legal settlement of disputed claim. 1897. Legal settlement. The words were cold, official, but Orville's gut, screaming with a newfound dread, knew the truth was anything but legal. Footsteps scraped behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Letty stood in the opening, her face pale and ghostly in the lantern light. She looked at the photographs scattered on the floor, at the documents clutched in his hands, and something in her expression finally cracked. It wasn't surprise. It was grief. An old, deep grief, as if she'd been carrying this moment on her back for decades. She'd known. She'd known this was here all along. "Your great-grandfather," she said, her voice barely a whisper, gesturing to Fletcher's photograph. "That's not possible," Orville stammered. "He's a Whitley." "Because they changed it," she said, her voice hardening. "They took everything. They rewrote the records, made it look like the land was lost in some legal fight. They made the entire family disappear." She moved to the wooden box and pulled out the worn leather journal with a reverence that chilled him to the bone. Fletcher's son. He wrote everything down. What they did, how they did it, who helped. She held it out to him. Orville couldn't make himself take it. Reading those words would make it real. It would confirm that his name, his family, his entire lineage was built on a foundation of theft and lies. But not taking it wouldn't change a single thing. The truth was already loose in the room. The journal felt cold in his hands. "Who did this?" Letty's jaw tightened into a hard line. "Men with money. Men who wanted this land and didn't care who they had to crush to get it. Samuel Banks was one of them. The man who gave you your name." Her words were like daggers. "He took the property, he took the Whitley identity, and he made sure no one would ever connect the dots." Orville's legs gave out. He sank to the floor, the journal pressed against his chest. Samuel Banks. The ancestor he'd been taught to respect. The man his father had told stories about. A thief. Worse than a thief. He'd erased an entire family from history. Letty lowered herself to the floor across from him, the weight of her years settling around her. "My father worked for Samuel Banks. He helped seal this room after the last Whitley descendant died, never knowing the truth of who he was. I was 12 years old. I watched them board it up. I watched them threaten anyone who might talk." With trembling fingers, Orville opened the journal. The first entry was dated 1898. The handwriting was careful, precise. 3 words that made his chest constrict so tightly he could barely breathe. They stole everything. He flipped through the pages, a blur of names, dates, and damning details. He saw proof of legal documents forged, of witnesses paid off, of a family systematically and ruthlessly destroyed, then forgotten. Until now. "Why didn't you tell someone?" he asked, his voice raw. Letty's expression hardened. "Because I was a child. Because my family needed the money Banks paid us to keep our mouths shut. And because by the time I was old enough to understand what justice really meant, everyone involved was already dead." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "Except me." She stood up slowly, her old bones creaking. "But you're not dead. You found what they tried to bury. Now you have to decide what that means." Orville looked at the photographs, at the documents, at the journal. It was evidence of a crime committed generations ago. Evidence that his name, his identity, his inheritance were all stolen. Letty moved toward the opening, then stopped. "There's one more thing," she said, and her voice went hollow, empty. "Fletcher's son wrote something in that journal that changes everything. The Whitleys didn't just lose their land." She looked back at him, and the look in her eyes was pure terror. "They lost something else. Something that would make you the rightful heir to more than just this barn." And with that, she climbed through the opening and disappeared, leaving him alone with documents that rewrote history and a terrible unnamed revelation hanging in the air. Orville spent the next 3 hours reading every single page. The lantern burned low, making the shadows crawl across the photographs like living things. Fletcher Whitley's son had documented everything with the precise, damning detail of a man who had lost everything but the truth. Names of conspirators, dates of forged signatures, the exact amounts paid to corrupt officials. But it was the final entries that made his hands go numb. The Whitleys hadn't just owned this barn and the surrounding acres. They'd owned the mineral rights to the entire valley. Rights that had been transferred to Samuel Banks right along with the property deed. Rights that were still active, still immensely valuable. His eyes darted to a metal cylinder he hadn't noticed before, tucked behind the wooden box. He twisted the cap. Inside were rolled-up documents, survey maps, geological assessments, letters from mining companies, all addressed to Fletcher Whitley, all dated just before the theft. The valley, this entire valley, sat on massive deposits of ore that had made other families' fortunes. The Banks family. His family. They hadn't been getting rich from farming or cattle for the last century. They'd been extracting unimaginable wealth from what lay beneath the ground. Wealth built on stolen land, drawn from veins of ore that should have belonged to the Whitleys. Orville's branch of the family had been living on the surface of their own inheritance, poor and ignorant, never knowing what pulsed just beneath their feet. If he could prove the theft, prove the fraudulent transfer, he could reclaim it all. Not just the barn, not just the name. He could reclaim the rights to everything underneath the valley floor. It would devastate the Banks family. It would destroy the fortune they'd built over generations, unmake their entire legacy of prosperity founded on lies. It would be justice. He climbed out into the main barn, the journal and the rolled-up maps clutched under one arm. Morning sun streamed through the gaps in the walls. Everything looked different now. The very wood beneath his feet had been walked on by thieves. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of secrets. A sound from outside froze him in place. Footsteps, multiple sets, and voices. He moved silently to a gap in the wall and peered out. 3 men stood near the entrance, dressed in expensive clothes that looked out of place against the rustic setting. Their faces were hard, their posture urgent. One of them pointed directly at the barn. Orville couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the man who was pointing, and his stomach clenched into a cold, hard knot. Marshall Tate, the current head of the Banks family mining operations, his cousin. A man who'd always treated Orville with a barely concealed contempt, looking down on him for being part of the poor branch of the family tree. The branch that got nothing. Now Orville understood why. Marshall and his companions moved closer. Orville pressed himself flat against the interior wall, the precious documents hidden behind his back. Through the gap, he watched Marshall's face survey the property. There was tension in every line of his body. And something else. Fear. They know, Orville realized with a jolt. Somehow, they know what's hidden here. The third man spoke, his voice carrying clearly on the morning air. "We need to tear this structure down, today, before anyone finds what might be inside." Marshall nodded grimly. "My great-grandfather should have burned it to the ground after he sealed the room. Leaving evidence was foolish." Evidence. They were talking about the hidden room, about the documents Orville now held in his hands, about the proof of the original monstrous crime. The second man shifted his weight nervously. What if someone's already found it? The property just sold. Marshall's expression darkened into something truly terrifying. Then we deal with whoever bought it, he said, his voice flat and cold. The same way my family has always dealt with problems. We make them an offer. If they refuse... He let the threat hang in the air for a moment. We make them disappear. Orville's blood turned to ice. These weren't just corrupt businessmen trying to protect a family legacy. They were willing to kill to keep this truth buried. The documents in his arms suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked down at Fletcher Whitley's journal, at the careful handwriting that had preserved the truth through decades of darkness, at the proof that could either restore justice to his real family or sign his own death warrant. The men outside started toward the barn entrance. Marshall pulled something from the inside of his coat. Even from this distance, Orville could see what it was. A revolver. Old but meticulously maintained. The kind of family heirloom that gets passed down through generations of men who were used to taking what they wanted by any means necessary. Orville had seconds to decide. Hide and pray they didn't find him. Run and lose everything he'd just discovered. Or face them, with the truth clutched in his hands. The barn door creaked open. A blade of sunlight flooded in, cutting through the dusty gloom. Marshall stepped inside. His eyes went straight to the corner, to the torn open wall, to the dark opening that revealed everything. Then he saw Orville, standing in the shadows, the journal and maps visible in his arms. For 3 long heartbeats, nobody moved. The world seemed to stop. Marshall's hand tightened on the revolver. His face, which had been pale with fear, transformed into something cold and ancient, a predatory stillness that had been in the bank's bloodline for generations. "Put those down," Marshall commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Orville held the documents tighter. "These belong to the Whitleys." Marshall took another step forward. The 2 men behind him fanned out, blocking any possible escape. "There are no Whitleys," Marshall said quietly, as if stating a simple fact. "That name died a long time ago." "It was a lie," Orville shot back, lifting the journal so Marshall could see it clearly. "Your great-grandfather made sure of it, but the truth was here all along." Marshall's jaw tightened. The revolver rose, its dark eye pointing directly at Orville's chest. "Give me the documents. Walk away. Pretend you never found any of this. I'll make sure you're compensated. Enough money that you'll never have to work another day in your life." Orville looked down at Fletcher Whitley's journal, at the photographs of his real ancestors, at the proof of a crime that had stolen his identity and shaped his entire life. He thought of the life of poverty his family had endured, while Marshall's had lived in luxury on stolen wealth. He wasn't walking away. Suddenly the barn door slammed open with a crack like thunder. Letty Webb stood in the entrance, and she wasn't alone. Behind her, a dozen townspeople formed a silent, grim-faced wall. Men and women who'd worked this land their whole lives, who knew its history, who'd carried the whispers and suspicions for decades. "My father told me on his deathbed what he helped Samuel Banks do." Letty's voice rang out, clear and strong. She stepped forward, and the crowd moved with her, a human tide of long-overdue justice. "I've kept silent for 50 years. Not anymore." Marshall's gun swung wildly toward Letty, then back to Orville. His face had gone from pale to a deep, blotchy red. "You're all witnesses to nothing. This is family business." A weathered farmer with iron-gray hair stepped forward from the crowd. "We're witnesses to a man holding a gun on another man in broad daylight. That's enough for the law, Marshall." Marshall's hand began to shake. Orville could see the frantic calculation in his eyes. Too many witnesses. Too much exposure. The empire his family had built on theft and silence was crumbling right before his eyes. But men with everything to lose are the most dangerous animals on earth. Marshall's finger tightened on the trigger. Orville saw it happen in slow motion. He saw the decision crystallize in Marshall's desperate eyes. But Marshall didn't fire at Orville. He swung the revolver toward the wooden box, still visible through the torn wall, toward the remaining priceless documents inside the hidden room. The shot exploded through the barn, deafening and violent. Splinters erupted from the wall. The crowd surged back, shouting in alarm. Marshall fired again and again, emptying the chamber into the hidden space where the truth had been kept safe for a century. Smoke filled the air, acrid and choking. When the echoes finally faded, Marshall stood with the empty revolver hanging at his side, his chest heaving. "If I can't have those documents," he gasped, "nobody can." The weathered townsman grabbed Orville, pulling him toward the exit. Through the chaos, Orville somehow kept his grip on the journal and the maps. Marshall had destroyed the remaining evidence, but not what he already held. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Real smoke, not just gunpowder. One of Marshall's wild shots had struck the old lantern. Oil had spread across the dry wooden floor. Now, hungry orange flames erupted, spreading with terrifying speed. The old barn, as dry as kindling, caught fire like it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Fire raced up the walls and across the ceiling beams. Black smoke billowed out, thick and suffocating. "Everyone out!" the weathered man yelled, shoving people toward the door. Orville stood frozen for a second, watching the flames consume the hidden room. All the photographs curling into black ash. The remaining documents turning to smoke. The proof of the Whitley legacy being erased for a second time. But through the smoke and the roaring flames, something on the back wall of the secret room caught his eye. Behind where the wooden box had sat, the intense heat of the fire was revealing words. Words that had been carved deep into the wood. Gouges blackened with age, now illuminated by the very flames that were consuming everything around them. It was a final message, left by Fletcher Whitley's son. Not meant to be found. Meant to be revealed only by destruction. The Whitley gave willingly what was taken by force. They chose mercy. Banks chose theft. Witness the difference. Orville stared at the words as the flames licked at them, obscuring them from view. Gave willingly? His mind raced, trying to understand. What in God's name did that mean? Strong hands grabbed him, dragging him toward the exit. The weathered townsman pulled Orville out into the bright sunlight, just as the main roof beam groaned and the entire structure collapsed inward with a deafening roar. They stumbled clear, coughing and gasping for air. Behind them, the barn was a raging inferno. Marshall stood between two townsmen who held his arms tightly. A young lawman was shouting orders, trying to organize an effort to contain the blaze, but it was far too late. The barn was lost. Everything inside was destroyed. Orville looked down at the journal in his hands. He'd somehow kept his grip through it all. The maps were there too, the edges singed but the ink intact. But that carved message burned in his mind brighter than any physical flame. The Whitley gave willingly. Letty appeared at his side, her face streaked with soot. She had seen the carving too. "That's what my father never told me," she choked out. "That's the secret. The one that makes everything different." "What does it mean, Letty?" Her eyes were distant, looking back through time. Fletcher Whitley was offered a choice. Samuel Banks wanted the land. He wanted the mineral rights. He made an offer, a fair one, according to my father. But Fletcher refused. He said the land was his legacy, his children's inheritance. She paused, struggling with the words, the old shame still raw. But before Banks could take it by force, Fletcher's wife, Sarah, she fell ill. Desperately ill. The medicine, the treatment, it all required money they simply didn't have. Orville's stomach turned over. He could see where this was going. A cold, sickening dread washed over him. Banks made his offer again, Letty continued, her voice trembling. This time, it was enough money to save Sarah's life. but only if Fletcher signed over the land immediately. If he didn't, Banks would wait. He would watch Sarah die, and then he would take the land anyway, after Fletcher was broken by grief and debt. The journal in Orville's hands suddenly felt 100 times heavier. So Fletcher agreed, to save his wife. Letty nodded, tears finally tracing clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. He gave the land willingly, under duress, under threat, but he signed the papers. That's why Banks always claimed the transfer was legal, because technically, Fletcher did sign. Marshall had stopped struggling. He stood with his head bowed, his body shaking, but it wasn't with rage anymore. It was with something that looked, impossibly, like relief. "My great-grandfather told the truth," Marshall said, his voice quiet and broken. "The land was transferred legally. Fletcher Whitley signed the documents." The young lawman looked between them, trying to piece together the fractured story. "So, there was no theft?" Marshall lifted his head, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, inherited shame. "Oh, there was theft, just not the kind you can prosecute in a court of law." He turned his gaze to Orville. "Your ancestor gave up his entire legacy to save the person he loved. Mine took advantage of that desperation and had the audacity to call it business." Orville looked at the burning ruin of the barn, at the journal in his hands, at the maps that proved a mineral wealth beyond measure. He was holding proof of a crime that wasn't technically illegal, evidence of a moral bankruptcy so profound that the law couldn't touch it. But something in Marshall's voice had changed. The fire hadn't just burned wood and paper. It had burned away a century of lies. The barn collapsed completely as the sun reached its peak, leaving nothing but smoldering ash and the stone foundation that had supported Fletcher Whitley's dream for generations. The lawman had taken statements, confiscated Marshall's revolver, and documented the destruction. Marshall now sat on the ground 20 feet from the ruins, his head in his hands. His two companions had vanished the moment the crowd had appeared. The townspeople stood in small clusters, whispering, watching, waiting to see what would happen now that the smoke was clearing and decisions had to be made. Orville approached his cousin slowly, the journal still gripped tight in his hand. Marshall didn't look up. "I thought I was protecting my family." Marshall's voice was raw, choked with emotion. "Defending what we'd built, what we'd earned." He finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed. "But we didn't earn any of it. We just told ourselves that taking from the desperate was the same thing as winning." Orville sat on the ground beside him. The earth was still warm from the fire. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "The lawman. He wants me to press charges," Orville said quietly. "For the shooting, for the arson." Marshall nodded, his gaze fixed on the smoking ruins. "I know." Orville opened the journal to a page near the end. Fletcher Whitley's son had written about the choice his father had been forced to make. About watching Sarah recover, while knowing the terrible cost. About seeing the weight of that forced sacrifice in his father's eyes every single day. He found the passage he was looking for. It was written after Sarah had passed away anyway, 3 years later, after all that sacrifice had bought them nothing but borrowed time. Orville read the words aloud. "My father told me that if he could choose again, even knowing Sarah would die regardless, he would still sign those papers. He would still give up everything, because those 3 years with her, they were worth more than all the land and all the minerals in the entire valley." Marshall's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "My great-grandfather took advantage of that. He took everything and called it a transaction." "Yes," Orville said, closing the journal. "But I'm not my great-grandfather, and you're not yours. We're just two men trying to figure out what justice looks like when the crime is too old to prosecute and too deep to ignore." Marshall wiped his face with the back of his hand. "What do you want from me? The truth is out. The whole town knows. My family's reputation is destroyed." I want to know if that ledger Letty mentioned is real, if there's more proof buried somewhere." Marshall was quiet for a long, heavy time. Then he stood and helped Orville to his feet. "It's real. My father told me about it before he died. He made me promise never to look for it, never to dig it up. Said some truths were too dangerous to unearth." He looked over at Letty, who stood with the weathered townsman, watching them. "But I know where it is. My father, he couldn't help himself. He told me the location, just in case the family ever needed to destroy it for good." Letty stiffened, her eyes wide. "You knew? You knew all along where my father's old workshop foundation was?" Marshall nodded, the shame evident on his face. "I've known for 20 years. I've driven past it 100 times, knowing what was buried underneath, knowing it could end everything we had." He turned back to Orville. "It's under the old mill, 2 miles east of here, the one everyone thinks is abandoned. The workshop foundation extends right beneath it." Letty's face went pale. "My father told me that mill burned down years ago." "My family bought it," Marshall confessed. "Through intermediaries. We kept it standing all these years specifically to protect what was underneath. We've been guarding that ledger for decades, too afraid to destroy it, and too terrified of what would happen if anyone ever found it." Orville felt the crushing weight of decades, of secrets and lies, settling on his shoulders. "So there's proof. Hard proof. Names, dates, payments, everything needed to show the world what Samuel Banks really was." "Yes." Marshall met his eyes. "And now you have to decide what to do with that knowledge." The lawman approached them, his notepad in hand. "Gentlemen, I need to know if there are going to be charges pressed, if there's evidence of a historical fraud that needs to be investigated." Orville looked at Marshall, then at Letty, then at the townspeople who had witnessed everything. He thought about Fletcher Whitley, forced to choose between his love and his legacy. About Sarah, who died anyway. About generations of Whitleys erased from history, and about the Banks family, built on a fortune of desperation and theft. The journal in his hands held one truth. The ledger under the old mill held another. Together, they could rewrite everything. Or Orville could walk away. Let the dead stay buried. Let the thieves keep their stolen empire. Let himself remain a Banks, living on the surface of a lie. But Fletcher Whitley hadn't walked away. He had made the impossible choice and paid the ultimate price. Now, his descendants stood at the very same crossroads, holding the power to finish what Fletcher had started. To reclaim what was taken, or to let mercy triumph over justice one final time. The lawman waited for an answer. The townspeople watched. Marshall stood with his head bowed, awaiting judgment. And Orville made his decision. Orville spoke, his voice clear and steady so that everyone could hear. "I want the ledger retrieved. I want every document examined. I want the truth recorded in the official records, so no one can ever erase the Whitleys again." A murmur went through the crowd. "But," he added, looking directly at Marshall, "I'm not pressing charges against Marshall Tate." Marshall's head snapped up, a war of confusion and profound relief on his face. The lawman frowned. "Sir, he destroyed evidence. He discharged a weapon. There are laws about these things." Orville held up the journal. "This is enough evidence for now. The ledger will provide the rest. But prosecuting Marshall won't change what Samuel Banks did a century ago. It won't bring back the Whitleys." He turned to Marshall. "Your family's mining operations will be investigated. The mineral rights will be examined. If they're found to be fraudulently obtained, they'll be returned to the rightful heirs. That's me. That's the Whitley line. You will lose the empire your great-grandfather built." Marshall nodded slowly, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I understand, and I accept it. But the money your family has already made, the wealth accumulated before today, that stays with you. I won't take everything from you." Orville's voice was firm. "Fletcher Whitley was forced to choose between love and land. I'm choosing not to repeat his suffering in reverse. Marshall's voice cracked. Why? Why show me mercy when my family showed yours none? Because forced choices destroy everyone they touch, Orville said simply. I won't force you into ruin the way your great-grandfather forced Fletcher to surrender everything. The lawman looked between the two men. So, to be clear, you want a full investigation into the original fraud, a restitution of the mineral rights, but no criminal charges for today's actions. Correct. Let the truth be known. Let the Whitley name be restored. Let the record show what really happened. But let the people living today have a chance to choose differently than their ancestors did. Letty stepped forward, tears finally streaming down her weathered face. Your great-grandfather would be proud, she whispered. Not because you reclaimed what was stolen, but because you broke the pattern. Orville handed the journal to the lawman. This needs to be preserved, copied, placed in the town records. The Whitleys existed, they mattered, they were erased, but they're not forgotten anymore. The lawman took the book carefully. And your name, sir? The official records list you as Orville Banks. Will you be seeking to change that? Orville thought about the question that had consumed him since he'd first seen those photographs. About identity and blood, and names that carried the weight of generations. I was born a Banks because of a crime I didn't commit. But I lived as a Banks. I married as a Banks. I buried my wife under that name. He looked at the smoking ruins of the barn. I'll carry both names forward. Orville Banks Whitley. So neither family is forgotten. So both truths are remembered. Marshall stood and extended his hand. Orville looked at it for a long moment, then clasped it. It wasn't a handshake of friendship, or even forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. An understanding that the chains of the past could, in fact, be broken by those willing to choose differently. The lawman organized a group to retrieve the ledger from beneath the old mill. The townspeople dispersed slowly, carrying with them a story that would reshape how they understood their own history. Marshall began arranging for documents proving the mineral rights transfer, working with the investigators who descended on the valley within days. The bank's mining operations were suspended, pending review. The fortune built on stolen ground was frozen. The empire built on Fletcher Whitley's forced sacrifice began its inevitable collapse. But Marshall didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood and faced every inquiry, answered every question, and provided every single record. The man who had held a gun just hours earlier now held himself accountable for a century of theft. 3 months later, Orville stood on the foundation where the barn had been. The land was his again, legally and rightfully. The mineral rights had been restored. The Whitley name now appeared in official records for the first time in over 100 years. He didn't rebuild the barn. Instead, he placed a stone marker on the foundation. It read, "Here stood Fletcher Whitley's barn, stolen through force disguised as mercy. Here his descendant, Orville Banks Whitley, reclaimed not just land, but truth." Letty joined him as the sun set over the valley that had held its secrets for far too long. "My father can rest now," she said quietly. "The truth he helped bury is finally free." Orville looked at the marker, at his name carved in stone. "Both names, both truths. I bought this barn for pennies, and I found a hidden room that changed my family's name forever. But what I really found in that room was the choice to be different than those who came before me." Letty smiled, a true, peaceful smile. "Fletcher would say that's worth more than all the minerals in the valley." They stood together as darkness fell, two people who had carried the weight of secrets, and now carried something both heavier and lighter at once. The weight of truth, and the freedom that came with finally speaking it. The investigation moved slowly at first. The Banks family had lawyers, very good ones. They filed motions, demanded proof, questioned the authenticity of every document. The journal Orville had saved was subjected to intense analysis. Handwriting experts, paper dating, Ink composition. Weeks stretched into months as men in expensive suits tried to argue why century-old crimes shouldn't matter anymore. Orville spent those weeks living in the small house next to where the barn had stood. Every morning, he walked to the foundation and stood where Fletcher Whitley had once built his dream, the stone marker he'd placed catching the early light. Marshall kept his word. He provided access to private family records, mining company documents, and financial ledgers that traced the family's wealth all the way back to its stolen source. But his relatives fought him at every turn. Cousins who'd lived comfortable lives on banks' money, uncles who ran subsidiaries, a sister who owned property throughout the valley. They all turned on him. They called him a traitor. They said he was destroying the family over nothing, that the past should stay buried. One afternoon, Marshall appeared at Orville's door. He looked 10 years older than he had 3 months before. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his suit was rumpled. "They want me out," he said without preamble. "The family is voting to remove me from all positions. They're threatening to contest everything I've provided to the investigation." Orville stepped aside and let him in. They sat at the small kitchen table in silence for a moment. "I knew it would cost me," Marshall continued, his voice strained. "I just didn't realize how much. My own sister won't speak to me. My cousin is spreading rumors that I'm mentally unstable, that you manipulated me somehow." "You can stop," Orville said. "You can walk away. The journal alone is enough to restore the Whitley name." Marshall shook his head firmly. "No, it's not about the journal anymore. It's about whether I'm going to be the man who finally told the truth, or the man who kept lying, because the truth was inconvenient." 2 weeks later, the investigators announced they were ready to excavate beneath the old mill. The entire town seemed to turn out to watch. Orville stood beside Letty as heavy machinery broke through the foundation stones that had hidden the secret for decades. After 6 hours of careful digging, they found it. A metal box, rusted but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them against time and moisture, the ledger and its supporting documents lay waiting. The head lawman opened the ledger right there on the site, as witnesses gathered close. It was all there, page after page in Samuel Banks's own handwriting. Names of officials who'd been paid off. The exact amounts transferred. Dates that corresponded perfectly to the forged property deeds. There were even letters from Fletcher Whitley's son, pleading with authorities to investigate, letters that had clearly been intercepted and never delivered. And then, on the final page, there was a confession. Samuel Banks had written it himself, perhaps as some kind of insurance, or perhaps in a rare moment of guilt. It read, "I took what Fletcher Whitley gave under duress. I used his wife's illness as leverage. I made him choose between love and legacy, knowing he would always choose love. This was theft dressed in legal proceedings. May whoever reads this understand that some crimes are committed with signatures and seals, not guns and masks." The crowd stood in stunned silence. Even the investigators seemed shocked. Letty's voice broke the quiet. "My father told me Samuel Banks wrote that, said he was drunk one night, sealed it in the box, and told my father to bury it. Said if the truth ever needed to come out, that would be proof that even lawyers couldn't argue with." The lawman closed the ledger carefully. "This changes everything. There is no legal defense against a written confession from the man himself. The property transfer was fraudulent. The mineral rights were stolen. The Banks family will have to return everything." Marshall stood apart from the crowd, alone. His family hadn't come. They had abandoned him completely the moment he'd sided with the investigation. Orville walked over to him. For a moment, they just stood side by side, looking at the box that held the final damning piece of the truth. "Your great-grandfather knew what he'd done," Orville said quietly. "He knew it was wrong. He just couldn't bring himself to make it right while he was alive." Marshall's voice was hollow. "And now I have to finish what he couldn't." "No," Orville said, turning to face him. Now you get to finish what he couldn't. There's a difference. One is punishment. The other is redemption. The lawman approached them, holding the ledger. This will take time to process through official channels, but the outcome is no longer in question. The mineral rights will be returned. The Banks family will lose all claims to the valley's resources. He looked directly at Orville. You'll be one of the wealthiest men in the territory once this is all settled. The deposits under this valley are worth more than most people could even dream of. Orville looked at the foundation where the barn had stood, at the marker bearing both his names, at the land that had been stolen from his ancestors and was now, finally, returned. I don't want wealth built on what was taken from Fletcher Whitley, he said. I want what's right. Let the investigation finish. Let the truth be recorded. Then we'll figure out what comes next. Marshall spoke up, his voice soft. There's one more thing you should know. The confession mentioned something else, something Samuel Banks buried along with the ledger. He nodded to the investigators who were still working at the excavation site. They pulled out a second, smaller box. Inside was a stack of letters, personal correspondence between Fletcher and Sarah Whitley during her illness. Letters where Fletcher wrote about his impossible, soul-crushing choice. Letters where Sarah begged him not to sacrifice their family's entire future for her. The letters showed that the depth of what had been stolen wasn't just land or money. It was love, forced to destroy itself in order to survive. And that, Orville realized, was the real crime Samuel Banks had committed. Not the theft of property, but the theft of peace. The theft of the ability to love without cost. The theft of the future Fletcher and Sarah should have had together, unburdened by the weight of what they'd been forced to give up. Those letters would be preserved too, not as evidence in a legal case, but as a testimony to what had been lost and what had, finally, been found again. The legal proceedings took another 6 weeks. The Banks family hired more lawyers, filed more motions, and tried every desperate tactic to delay the inevitable. But Samuel Banks's own written confession left them no room to argue. The property transfer had been fraudulent. The mineral rights had been stolen. The century of wealth extracted from the valley's deposits belonged to the Whitley line. Orville sat in the courtroom when the final judgment was read. Marshall sat on the opposite side, completely alone. His family had disowned him, blaming him for the collapse of their empire, for choosing truth over loyalty, for betraying his own blood. The judge's voice was measured and clear. The evidence is incontrovertible. The property known as the Whitley Tract, along with all associated mineral rights, was obtained through fraud and coercion in 1897. The transfer is hereby declared null and void. All rights, privileges, and assets derived from said property are to be returned to the legal heir of Fletcher Whitley. The judge looked directly at Orville. That would be you, Mr. Banks Whitley. The courtroom erupted. Banks family members shouted in anger. Some wept openly. Others stormed out, their generations of unearned prosperity vanishing in a single pronouncement. Orville simply sat quietly, the old journal resting in his lap. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. The story had spread like wildfire throughout the territory. Poor man buys abandoned barn, discovers his real name, reclaims stolen fortune. It was the kind of tale that sold newspapers. Orville pushed through the crowd without saying a word. Letty was waiting for him with a wagon, and they rode back to the property in silence. That night, Orville sat at his small table, documents spread out before him. Mining company assessments, geological surveys, financial projections. The valley held deposits worth more money than he could spend in 5 lifetimes. Money that would now flow to him, every month, for as long as the mines operated. Money built on what had been stolen from Fletcher Whitley. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Marshall stood outside, holding his hat in his hands. They've taken everything from me, he said, his voice flat. My position, my home, my name, really. The Banks family wants nothing to do with a traitor. Orville gestured for him to come inside. They sat across from each other, two men who had once been cousins under false pretenses and were now something else entirely. Not quite friends, not enemies, but something new and undefined. "I came to say I'm leaving the valley," Marshall said. "There's nothing for me here anymore. But I wanted you to know what you did. Showing mercy when you could have destroyed me completely. That meant something. It changed something." "Where will you go?" "East. Start over with a different name. Work for what I have instead of inheriting it." He managed a bitter smile. "Be someone new. Like you did, in a way." Orville thought about that. About names and identity. About inheriting theft versus earning truth. The money your family made before the judgment. You kept that. Use it to build something honest. Marshall nodded. "I will. And maybe someday, when enough time has passed, I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror without seeing my great-grandfather's face." After Marshall left, Orville returned to the documents on his table, to the projections of immense wealth that would soon be his, to the choice of what to do with a fortune built on stolen ground. He thought about Fletcher Whitley, forced to trade everything he had for 3 more years with Sarah. He thought about the letters between them, showing a love that couldn't be bought but could be leveraged. He thought about a man who had given up his legacy to save what mattered most. And Orville made a decision that he knew Fletcher would have understood. The next morning, he met with the town council and the lawmen. He brought the geological surveys, the mining projections, all the documents that detailed the valley's incredible wealth. "I am establishing a trust," he announced. "The mineral rights will stay in my name, but all of the income will be divided. Half of it goes to the families whose land sits above the mineral deposits. They've been living on top of wealth they never knew was there. That changes now." The council members stared at him, mouths agape. "The other half," he continued, "will be used to fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure for this entire valley. Fletcher Whitley wanted this land to be his children's inheritance. Well, we're all his children now. Everyone who lives here, everyone who works this ground, we are his legacy." Letty, who had come to witness the announcement, spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "You're giving away a fortune." "No," Orville corrected her gently. "I'm using a fortune the way Fletcher would have wanted, to build something lasting, to create the legacy that was stolen from him." The lawman leaned forward. "You realize this makes you unique, sir. Most men who reclaim stolen wealth keep it. They guard it. You're distributing it before you've even received the first payment." Orville looked out the window at the foundation where the barn had stood, at the stone marker bearing both his names. "Fletcher Whitley taught me that some things matter more than money. He proved it by giving up everything for love. I'm proving it by giving up wealth for community." He turned back to the stunned council. "That's the real inheritance, not the minerals in the ground. It's the choice to be different." The trust was established within days. Legal documents were drawn up, signed, and sealed. The bank's family mining operations were dismantled and reorganized under new ethical management. The first royalty payments to the Valley families went out within the month. Orville kept only enough to live simply. A small house, simple food, and the freedom to walk his land without the crushing weight of stolen wealth pressing down on his every step. And for the first time since he'd pressed his hand against that hollow wall and discovered a truth that had upended his world, he felt light. The burden of secrets was gone. The weight of stolen names was lifted. And in their place was something rare and incredibly valuable. Peace. 1 year after the judgment, Orville stood on the foundation where Fletcher Whitley's barn had once held its secrets. The stone marker still caught the morning light, casting shadows across the 2 names carved into its surface. But the land around it had changed. To the north, a new school building rose against the sky, paid for by the trust funds derived from the mineral rights. Children from valley families, some of whom had never seen the inside of a proper classroom, were now learning to read and write. Their parents, who had once struggled on farms that barely produced enough to survive, now received quarterly payments from the wealth that lay deep beneath their land. To the south, a hospital was nearing completion. The valley had never had proper medical facilities. People had died from illnesses that could have been easily treated. That was ending, and throughout the valley, roads were being improved, wells were being dug, and an infrastructure that would last for generations was being built. All of it was funded by the wealth that had been stolen from Fletcher Whitley and had finally been returned to his descendants. All of them. Every person who called this valley home. Letty approached with careful steps, her age showing more clearly now than it had a year before. But there was a deep peace in her face that hadn't been there before. "My father would weep if he could see this," she said. "Not from grief, from relief. Relief that the silence he was forced to keep finally ended in something so good." Orville watched the workers laying the foundation stones for the new hospital. "Fletcher gave up everything for 3 more years with Sarah. I'm just using what he lost to build something that will last longer than any of us." "You changed more than just property ownership, Orville. You changed how people here think about the past." Letty gestured toward the new school. "Those children are learning the real history now. About the Whitleys, about what was stolen and what was reclaimed, and about choosing mercy over vengeance." A wagon approached on the eastern road. Orville didn't recognize it at first. Then the driver climbed down, and he saw Marshall's face. It was thinner than before, weathered by hard work rather than worry. And there was something different in his expression, something that looked like peace. "I heard about what you built," Marshall said as he walked up. "I had to come see it for myself." They stood there together. 3 people, connected by secrets that no longer had any power, by truths that had been buried, and were now, finally, free. "I found work in a mining operation, 3 territories over," Marshall said. "Started at the bottom. Hard labor, honest pay." He managed a genuine smile. "Nobody there knows the bank's name. I'm just Marshall, a man who works for what he has. That's all any of us should be." Marshall looked at the stone marker bearing both names. "I thought about changing mine completely, starting over with something new. But I realized that would be running from what my great-grandfather did, instead of carrying the weight of it." He met Orville's eyes. "So I kept it. Banks. As a reminder that a legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you choose to do with what you're given." Orville understood completely. They had both inherited names connected to a great theft. One had been the victim's descendant. The other had been the thief's. But both of them had chosen to be different than their ancestors. That was the real inheritance. The choice. Letty pulled a folded letter from her coat pocket. "This arrived yesterday from the territorial government. They want to name the new school after Fletcher Whitley. To make sure his name is remembered, not just for what was stolen from him, but for what his descendant built from that theft." Orville took the letter and read it slowly. The Fletcher Whitley School. A permanent monument, not to loss, but to what came after loss. To resilience. To truth. To the choice to build instead of destroy. He would have liked that, Orville said softly. Not the monument itself, but knowing that children would learn in a building that bears his name. That his legacy wasn't theft after all. It was education, opportunity, a future. Marshall spoke quietly. "My great-grandfather's legacy is a confession sealed in a box, admitting to crimes he never made right. Your great-grandfather's legacy is a school, a hospital, and a valley full of people who finally know the truth." He paused. "That's the difference between us, between them, between every choice we make." They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the foundation stones that had once supported lies and now supported truth. The hollow wall was gone. The hidden room was ash. The secrets were recorded in official documents where no one could ever erase them again. But the land remained. The valley remained. And the people who lived here now knew their real history. They knew that Fletcher Whitley had existed, had built, had loved, had sacrificed, had been erased, and was, at long last, remembered. Orville looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had pressed against that wall and discovered the echo that changed everything. The same hands that now held the journal Fletcher's son had written. The same hands that had signed the documents distributing a fortune instead of hoarding it. "I bought this barn for pennies," he said quietly, more to himself than to them. "I found a hidden room that gave me back my real name. But what I really found was the choice to be more than my ancestors. To take what was stolen and turn it into something they never could have imagined." Letty smiled. "Fletcher would say that's what inheritance should always be. Not taking what others built, but building something better yourself." Marshall extended his hand one final time. "Thank you," he said. "For showing me what it means to choose differently, for teaching me that mercy is stronger than vengeance." Orville clasped his hand firmly. "And thank you for having the courage to tell the truth, even when it cost you everything." They parted then, three people who had been bound by secrets and were now freed by truth. Marshall returned to his wagon and his new life. Letty walked toward the school where she had volunteered to teach history, the real history. And Orville remained on the foundation, with both names carved in stone beneath his feet. Banks and Whitley. Thief and victim. Both a part of him. Both a part of the valley's story. Both a part of what came next. He thought about the hollow wall that had started it all. About an echo that revealed more than it should. About the choice between hiding the truth and speaking it. Between inheriting theft and building a legacy. Between being who your ancestors were and becoming who you choose to be. The marker caught the light one last time, casting shadows that looked as if the two names were finally reaching toward each other instead of standing apart. And Orville Banks Whitley, descendant of both theft and mercy, builder of the future and keeper of the truth, walked toward the school bearing his great-grandfather's name, ready to teach the next generation what real inheritance truly meant. It's not what you take. It's what you choose to build from what you're given. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where choices and consequences collide in the most unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a comment to let us know what you would have done.